UK elections can be hard for people outside the UK to understand. So I'm doing a few videos on the election, but I'm doing them with a mind to educating people from outside the UK on how it all works, why it works the way it does, what the typical battlegrounds of elections are, and so on. The NHS looms large over just about any election that we have at any level, pretty much. Maybe not so much the European elections, but local elections, regional elections, national elections, all of those, it's a big important issue. Indeed, it's such a big and important issue in the UK that independent candidates, when they do win, whether it be at the council or the national level, those are typically involved in some kind of local healthcare issue, like the closing of a hospital or whatever, and they stand for election so that they can prevent whatever it is that's being planned to be taken away. The National Health Service is a huge issue, and it's a huge problem for political parties, whatever the situation, whatever political party they are. Now, the National Health Service was instituted in the post-war years, and it's all the more remarkable, even miraculous, an institution given the context in which it arrived. We just fought a world war. We were still on the ration. The country did not have a great deal of money, and yet we managed to institute national health care, and it was a fantastic and great success, and has had massive positive impact on our society as a whole, and has become a beloved institution that most people don't see that they could live without. This is why when Americans balk at the idea of paying for a national health service or having a national health service, I can't take it seriously, because we managed when we were skint, and it has been pretty much an unalloyed positive all around. It makes sense for any health service to be run in a socialised way. It works better. The statistics are in, the studies are in, we know this. So it was founded, and this is very important, by the Labour Party. Bevin was the architect of the NHS, almost like a patron saint of the NHS in many ways. And when it came in, medicine was advancing, but it was still fairly primitive. Up until that point, you'd mostly been paying local doctors for treatment and so on, but they would do the rounds, but it was expensive. And there's a few people around today still who remember what it was like before the advent of the NHS, and they tell you similar horror stories to the ones that we hear going on in the US. People delaying care because they can't afford it, going bankrupt for care because they want to live, or even allowing themselves to die because they don't want to bankrupt their family. Yeah, a lot of people died, but I guess they weren't people that anyone really cared about up to a point. Then the NHS comes in, and everyone was guaranteed a certain basic provision of care, at least. And then over time it expanded, it got bigger, it got better, it got more modernised, and to the point where it has become this beloved institution in the UK. And who doesn't like nurses, really? And it's Labour's issue. Labour is at a huge advantage whenever discussions about the NHS come up. Waiting lists, provision, funding, hospitals, all of that. Labour's generally in favour of taxing more and then spending more on the NHS to keep it up to date. So it's their issue to lose, right? They can't really lose when it comes to backing the NHS. It's their invention. They're justifiably proud of it, and whenever they've been in power, they've generally done a lot to safeguard the NHS. Blair's New Labour tried to find a kind of happy middle ground, I think, between private and public in the NHS, but it didn't really work out. And the Tories have always fiddled with it and resented its very existence, and many of them can't seem to wrap their head around the idea of something not being for profit. So the Conservatives tend to do rather badly politically when it comes to the NHS, and pretty much everyone other than the Conservatives is a wholesale rah-rah cheerleader fan of the NHS one way or another. They just disagree on exactly how much money and where the focus should be and things like that. The Conservatives know this, and so they try to flim-flam people. They hide the slow creeping privatisation that goes on whenever they're in power. They hide that they're starving the NHS of funding to make it look incompetent and ripe for privatisation by fiddling the statistics. They pretend they're dumping a load of money into making new hospitals and building them when they're not really. It's an old plan, it's old money earmarked long ago, and they're not accelerating anything or making any real difference. But, people get fooled. And there are people who have bad experiences in the NHS, just as they do in any healthcare system. It is done on the basis of triage, so there can be long wait times while people with more acute conditions or greater need can come in ahead of you. But this slow creeping privatisation has gone on throughout my lifetime, certainly. You've got to remember I was young when Thatcher came to power, and that's when it really all started going to pot. At this point, finding an NHS dentist is incredibly difficult. The old stereotype about the Brits having bad teeth didn't used to be particularly true. We didn't have pretty teeth, we didn't have Hollywood teeth, but the provision of NHS dentistry and its near universal availability meant that we tended to have strong and healthy teeth, just not Hollywood teeth. Now it's incredibly hard to find an NHS dentist. They usually have long waiting lists to sign up for them, and if you go private, it's expensive. 40, 50, 60 quid to see a dentist once every 6 months. That's assuming there's nothing wrong with you, right? It's not particularly affordable. Another thing that I noticed growing up, I had bad eyesight. I've had bad eyesight since the beginning of secondary school, and it's just gotten progressively worse. You used to get NHS vouchers and even NHS frames, though they were clunky and horrible and no kid would be caught dead wearing them if they could at all help it. But for someone like me with really bad eyesight, the cost ramps up to a point where last time I paid old style prices for a pair of spectacles, I think it was over £200. And if it hadn't been for the advent of cheap Chinese glasses makers selling online, I would be hard pressed to get glasses still. I'd have to save up, I'd have to take time, and as for getting a second pair of sunglasses or something, I would be out the window, basically. So we've seen that change in my lifetime. I did have my wisdom teeth out privately, but see, one of the knock-on effects of the NHS is that it makes private care more affordable by driving down the price. So even plebs like me can, if we need to, get private care to top up if we particularly need something pretty quick. And my wisdom teeth were coming in sideways, so that's why I had it. I'm not throwing in these anecdotes to be persuasive per se, just to show that I have lived through these changes and I've seen them. So this election, obviously the NHS is a big issue, and the parties seem to want this election not to be about Brexit, but they're fooling themselves. And when people say, we don't want this election to be about Brexit, we want it to be about the NHS and education and the economy, and all of these things are inexorably tied to Brexit. There is just no getting away from it. There's people saying Brexit isn't important, there's more bigger things, bigger concerns in the country. Brexit affects all of them, right? Or no Brexit, or a hard Brexit. Brexit of any form affects these policy issues, these battlegrounds when it comes to an election. And the NHS in particular is no exception. How so? Well, if we do some sort of trade deal with the US after we Brexit, if we Brexit, Trump and the US healthcare system wants in, right? They basically want to buy up the NHS. It's a huge captive audience. It's like adding another very populous, relatively wealthy state onto the US, basically. And they want to charge us more for the drugs that we buy for the NHS, and They just basically want to gouge us and be involved in the privatisation, and so any trade deal that we do with the US, the NHS basically has to be up for grabs. Or so it would seem, and it does seem like there have been secret talks between the current incumbent UK government and the current incumbent US government and the private healthcare firms in the US about this sort of thing, about drug prices and so on. Channel 4 Dispatches did the show on that. You can watch that on Channel 4's Catch Up, or someone's probably got it up on YouTube by now, but you can go and watch that. Channel 4 has a pretty good YouTube channel. They might have some news articles on that. Channel 4 News is pretty good, amongst the best, better than BBC these days, I'd say. So you can go and look into that. So already the Tories are on the back foot there, because it's known they want to privatise and sell off the NHS.
The concept that the people running the Brexit campaign would care for the National Health Service is a rather odd one. I seem to remember, Michael Gove wanted to privatise it, Boris wanted to charge people for using it, and Ian Duncan Smith wanted a social insurance system. The NHS is about as safe with them as a pet hamster would be with an hungry python. So I don't think that's very wise.
And the idea is that we'll quickly do a deal with the states in which the NHS is under threat. But that's not the only way in which Brexit is involved, or in which the current government is involved. The current government took away bursaries for nurse training, which made it more affordable for people. So we've got a shortfall of nurses anyway. We've got a further shortfall of nurses because the bursaries have been taken away. And we're going to have a further shortfall of nurses because if we Brexit, we're not going to get the EU nurses coming over to work in the NHS. And if you are one of those racists and xenophobes that voted for Brexit, I think what you have to understand is that we're going to need nurses and doctors and dentists. There is a shortfall. We can't train them. The government's taken away the funding to train nurses, and so they're going to have to come from somewhere. And if they're not coming from the European Union, they're going to have to come from the rest of the world. And a lot of you won't like that, because a lot of them are going to be Muslim and a lot of them are going to be brown. So you have to ask yourselves, my imaginary racist xenophobe that I'm addressing, would you rather have an NHS staffed in part by Slavs and Poles and French and Germans and whoever else from Europe with whom we share a great deal, as you insist on telling me all the time, or would you rather they come from Pakistan and Iran and Iraq and Syria and Africa? What would you prefer? It's just impossible to disentangle Brexit from the NHS issue, and if we Brexit, the NHS is going to be fucked. Staffing, the economy's going to take a hit. There'll be less money, whichever government is in power, to plough into the NHS. Problems with shipping, drugs and so on. It will be short term, the worst of it, but longer term there'll still be problems, and prices are likely to go up, which means prescription fees are likely to have to go up faster than they already do. And so it goes, and so it goes, and so it goes. It is basically impossible to disentangle the NHS from the Brexit issue. And a lot of people, including a lot of Brexiteers, argue that the NHS is one of the most important and valuable things to them. But any form of Brexit is going to screw it, and a hard Brexit most of all. So while the NHS is an overriding and a powerful historical issue, if you really want to save the NHS, you have to vote for a Remain party. That's just how it goes. So the NHS, historically, Labour's to lose on. Conservatives want to privatise it. Nobody else does. And it's a hugely important issue to most Britons, and most Britons love the NHS. So that's why it will loom large, especially in this election, and we're likely to see a lot of politicians shaking hands with doctors and nurses, or being badmouthed by doctors and nurses, which is probably more likely. Zang. At the end of World War II, the Axis and the Allies went to war with A-bombs until nobody was left to fight. In this atomic wasteland, a new breed of rockabilly hero arises, From the gleaming domes of Science City Zero to the sleazy roller derbies of Vegas and the sky fortress of the Fourth Reich, there's a new world for the taking. 45, Psychobilly Retropocalypse. Available at lulu.com and RPG Now.